This is a webinar on the Deafblind International Conference 2023. The webinar is called An Intervention to Enhance Multiparty Communication of Persons with Congenital Deafblindness and Their Communication Partners. Development, Overview and Initial Experiences. This webinar is prepared by Mijkje and Saskia Dame, but will be presented today by myself, which is Mijkje. Before we dive into the topic, I'll first start introducing myself. As said, my name is Mijkje and I'm a Dutch woman. I have a white skin color, brown straight hair, blue eyes, and I'm wearing a grey sweater. As said, I work as a psychologist at Bartiméus, which is a Dutch care organization for people with visual impairment. Myself, I'm specialized in the care on people with deafblindness. And currently I'm also doing a research, which I will present here today, and I'll do that in collaboration with Groningen University. Learning to communicate is an essential skill. Communication is important for learning all other skills. In everything that we learn, communication is involved in one way or another. For example, you get instructions or you receive warnings when you're not doing it right. And by reading an explanation, communication is also involved. And besides that, communication is very important in building and maintaining social relationships. So, for people with congenital deafblindness, building communication skills is first priority, not only at an early age, but also at an adult age. Because we never stop learning, and in the care for people with congenital deafblindness, we can always keep doing our best to improve the communication skills of the person with congenital deafblindness. We see that people who have barely any means of communication cannot express themselves really well. And because of that, we as professionals cannot get a good idea of their true capacities. Maybe that person has a lot of opportunities to understand things, but we do not use them very well because we don't know how. So that's why we always have to make efforts to communicate, also with these people. On this slide you also see an image, and on this image you see two partially overlapping text clouds. There's also an arrow pointing at the overlapping part of the text clouds with the text, "This is the good stuff." So, learning to communicate is a primary goal of many programs to foster development in general for people with congenital deafblindness. And when you look a bit further to communication, you can dive into which topics are being communicated between the persons. And for people with congenital deafblindness, we often see that the things that are being communicated are wishes, preferences, needs, plans about the next activity. They communicate accordance or rejection, so saying yes or no, etc. But there is also a kind of communication about feelings and thoughts, about ideas and sharing experiences and retrieving memories. And those kind of communications are not that often communicated with people with congenital deafblindness. However, we as seeing hearing persons do communicate very much on these topics. So this is something that is missed in the communication with people with congenital deafblindness very often. Here you see an image of how communication with people with congenital deafblindness usually is. And this image is an image of a person who is connected to 12 other persons, each with an individual arrow. Because all our interventions are based on dyadic or one-on-one relationships. And we also see that many contexts, just in daily life, of people with congenital deafblindness are on one-on-one relationships. And of course that's obvious because they cannot very well notice how other people are communicating together. But that also means that they cannot learn or witness how communication lives around them. They only witness the communication with them directly. And that communication between others is being presented on this image. This is an image of many people who are all connected to different persons with several lines between each other. And this is how communication really is. We all have all kinds of relationships, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes two together, sometimes a whole group. And this kind of communication where people are all interconnected and also witness others being interconnected, this is not obvious for people with congenital deafblindness. And this is what we want to encourage with the current intervention. Multiparty communication is one of the few ways in which a person with congenital deafblindness can experience how others behave themselves within social relationships. And by listening in on others' conversations, you experience all kinds of things, what is being accepted and what is not, and which reactions behavior can get, and how misunderstandings can be repaired. And because they listen to others communicating, they have time to reflect on what is happening and to learn from what is happening. And this way of learning, which is called observational learning, is an important element in social cognitive theory. And also being in groups, being together with multiple others, gives a sense of belonging or collectiveness. You can experience how you can be together with someone and have a different opinion to others, for example. So multi-party communication can really contribute to the development of communication skills. So how can we as communication partners encourage multi-party communication? Before this study, I have done a focus group study in which I asked this question to people who communicate with people with congenital deafblindness. So those are the professional caregivers and the family network. And they told me that they try to do MPC once in a while, but they find it very difficult to persist, to keep doing it. And they find it they don't really know how they can do multi-party communication with people with congenital deafblindness. They say they do it sometimes, but not often enough. And they suggested to develop an intervention to help them find out how they can do and maintain multi-party communication with their people with congenital deafblindness. So that's what we did in this study. We developed an intervention and we tested this intervention in a pilot study with 2 people with multi-party communication. And after this, we will also do an intervention study with 10 cases in which multi-party communication happens. And that intervention study will try to find out what the intervention does, but that's the next part of the research. In order to develop this intervention, we have used the method intervention mapping. And intervention mapping is a way of developing interventions in healthcare and has been used more often, but unfortunately not as far as we know in deafblind specific programs. But the advantage of intervention mapping is that you take everything into account. You use theory, you use practical questions, you use input from all kinds of stakeholders, and by that you have a firm and solid intervention which you hopefully can use for the benefit of your choice. And on this slide you see an image of the book on intervention mapping, and it's called Planning Health Promotion Programs from Bartiméus, Eldridge and others. The process of intervention mapping consists of 6 steps, and those steps are first to develop a logic model of the problem, then to produce a model of change, then making a program design, a program production, a program implementation plan, and lastly an evaluation plan. And after that follows implementation, and then evaluation, and then the whole circle starts again. And it's not only going on and on, but it's also an iterative process in which all the steps, you can also always go back to steps when you find out that things need to be modified in your intervention. And when we look at our own program, we had some goals for implementation, and those were that we wanted communication partners to gain confidence in doing multi-party communication. And we also wanted that people with congenital deafblindness would like to be doing multi-party communication, and that communication partners offer multi-party communication more often to people with congenital deafblindness. And by doing so, we wanted that multi-party communication would help people with congenital deafblindness to learn social and language skills. And of course, we also wanted to see that it would be learned more in this type of communication than in dyadic communication. So those were the goals for implementation, which we tested by the study of the intervention. And while preparing the intervention, we found out that we didn't only have to focus on the person with congenital deafblindness and their communication partner, but that also the involved therapists like the psychologist or the speech therapist or occupational therapist who were involved with the person with congenital deafblindness needed to take part in the intervention. And we also found out that managers needed to be involved into the intervention. And that's why we also made intervention goals on these levels in order to encourage implementation of the multi-party communication intervention. The primary intervention elements were an education session, which was approximately 1 to 1.5 hours. We did video analysis with communication partners. We had an evaluation session, and we also needed to disseminate information about the intervention to therapists, managers, and non-participating communication partners. The most important elements of the education session were to provide some theoretical background about the importance of multi-party communication. We discussed specific aspects of multi-party communication, and we wanted to support it by video examples of multi-party communication in order to show them how it can be done. So the video examples were of people with congenital deafblindness. Now I'd like to show you one of the video examples that we use in the education session. This is a video of a woman with congenital deafblindness and 2 of her professional caregivers. In the education session, this video is used to show as an example of a relatively easy situation to start multi-party communication in. And in this case, it is a situation where one of the professional caregivers has been there all day and she says goodbye to the person with congenital deafblindness, and a new caregiver comes in and says hello. I'd like to show the video right now to you, and I will simultaneously explain what is happening on screen. This video starts with an image of the person with congenital deafblindness lying on the couch, and then the first caregiver comes into view. And the first caregiver signs to the person with deafblindness, "Watch me talk." And she pulls her legs away and sits beside the person with congenital deafblindness. And the caregiver says, "Sit, talk." And she says, "Look there," and she points. And she says, "I," and she points to the second caregiver. And the person with deafblindness pulls the second caregiver towards her. And the second caregiver says, "I," and she shows her personal referrer. And then the first caregiver says, "I," and also shows her personal referrer. And she says, "I go away." And she signs, "You, bread, eating," and she points to the second caregiver. And then the person with deafblindness says, "Toothbrushing." And the second communication partner says, "Later." And she says, "You and I watch," and she points upwards where the referrers are hanging. And she shows the referrer spoon to the person with deafblindness, which means eating. And then the person with deafblindness pulls her hand away and points alongside her head. And the second caregiver says, "You go eating." And then the person with deafblindness points at the table. And the first caregiver says, "I away," and "You," and she moves her hand to the second caregiver and she goes away. And then the person with deafblindness says, "Eating," and she gets up. And the second caregiver says, "Okay." And together they walk to the table. This is a video example of a natural situation. And the video example is only used to show how easy multi-party communication can be in a natural situation. It is not it's not meant to be a perfect example of multi-party communication, because always things can be improved. But it's more to get the attention of the persons who will want to start multi-party communication, and make them think about how to apply multi-party communication in their own situation. So now that we've developed an intervention, of course we also want to know if it works before applying it in practice. And that's why we did an effect study. We did it in 2 phases. First, we had a pilot with 2 persons with congenital deafblindness and their communication partners who did a multi-party communication. And after that, we had a broader multiple case study in which participated 10 clients with congenital deafblindness and their communication partners. The aim of the intervention study was to evaluate the effect of the multi-party communication intervention on the social behavior and on the language use between people with congenital deafblindness and their communication partners. And on this slide you see an image, a drawing of 3 people who are doing a multi-party communication sitting on chairs. Now I'll tell you about the intervention protocol. The intervention study started each time with baseline videos, and those baseline videos were with dyadic, so one-on-one communication between the person with congenital deafblindness and each of the participating communication partners. And we requested 5 baseline videos per communication duo. So we had 10 baseline videos per case. After the baseline phase, we had an education session with the communication partners in which we told something about multi-party communication and the background, and also were thinking a bit about how we can apply multi-party communication in their personal situation with the person with congenital deafblindness. After the education session, the communication partners started practicing multi-party communication with the person with congenital deafblindness, and they videotaped themselves, or we videotaped them 5 times. And between each video observation, we had video feedback sessions in which we discussed the preceding video and looked for what to improve or how what went right. After the video feedback sessions, we had a general evaluation, and then started the follow-up phase in which we asked for a follow-up video after 3, 6, 9 and 12 months. The video recordings from this study were coded by 2 independent coders. And with the video coding, we looked for the strategies of the person with congenital deafblindness, which were their use of language, their referential communication, their initiatives, and their attention. We also looked at the strategies of the communication partners, and those were the communication outside the here and now, so about other things than in the here and now, and their use of personal pronouns. And we looked for interaction categories, which were the shared positive affect and the cohesiveness. We also collected questionnaire information, and the communication partners filled out questionnaires, first of all about the person with congenital deafblindness, being their development level of functioning, their social functioning, their language use and language understanding. And we also asked them to fill out a questionnaire about the social validity and their self-efficacy. And the questions were collected pre and post intervention. With the next slides, I will tell you about the results of our pilot study, in which 2 persons with congenital deafblindness and their communication partners participated. The 2 pilot cases were about first a male adult who is completely blind and deaf, has congenital rubella syndrome and a severe intellectual disability. And the other one is about a female child who has a vision impairment and a hearing impairment and a severe intellectual disability. And the male adult lives in a residential living situation and does the multi-party communication with 2 of his professional caregivers. And the child is at her school for children with deafblindness, and she does the multi-party communication with her teacher and her speech therapist. First, we looked at the language of the person with congenital deafblindness. And here we saw that both persons with congenital deafblindness had more contact initiatives within the multi-party communication than in the dyadic communication, which means that they had more turns in the multi-party communication setting. One of the participants also had more language in the multi-party communication than in the dyadic communication, but the other participant did not. But this second participant did use more language with one of the communication partners in the multi-party communication when we compared the multi-party communication to the individual communication. And we saw that the amount of referential communication, so communication that refers to something else, was not different in multi-party communication than in dyadic communication. It didn't occur that much at all, and it also looked like it was dependent on which situation the people were in, so the situation in which was communicated. We also looked at the attention of the person with congenital deafblindness within the dyadic and the multi-party communication. And we wanted to know if the attention was directed into the interaction context, so aimed at the partner or the topic of interaction or other things within the interaction, or if the attention was not at the interaction. And we saw that the level of attention of the person with congenital deafblindness was already very high in dyadic communication. However, we saw that it was increased in the multi-party communication when compared to the dyadic communication. We also looked at the communication partners and compared their results of the dyadic communication to the multi-party communication. We looked at their communication outside the here and now, so about other topics than in the direct interaction context, which is also being called declarative communication. And we saw that in the multi-party communication, there was more declarative communication than in the one-on-one dyadic communication. But with both participants, communication outside the here and now was not very huge. There was only a few communication like this. We also looked at the use of personal pronouns, of which we thought that a person with congenital deafblindness could learn the difference between the different communication partners. So you and I and she or he or the other. And this was also increased within the multi-party communication as compared to the dyadic communication. And we saw that in one of the participants, one of the communication partners really had different initiatives in the multi-party communication than in the dyadic communication, but the other communication partner did not. So when taken together, you see that the communication partners' communication was very different in the multi-party communication than in the dyadic communication. We also looked at the interaction as a whole, and we only did that for the multi-party communication. And we looked at the cohesiveness, in which we looked how people collaborated together to ensure a good interaction. And we looked at the positive affect, in which we looked to the sharing of positive emotion within the multi-party communication, because we thought that the cohesiveness and a good positive effect would help the person with congenital deafblindness to learn within the multi-party communication. And when you look at the interaction scores for participant 1 on the left, you see that there is an increase or a positive effect for participant 1. And when you look at participant 2, which is on the right of this slide, you see that there are no substantial changes between the first in a multi-party communication session and the last one, but the scores were already very high in the beginning. So there was cohesiveness and positive affect, so that should be a good base to learn from the communication. We transcribed the communication within the sessions, and we looked how much communication there was uttered in the videotapes. And when we looked for participant 1, then we saw that the participant themselves did not really differ between the dyadic communication and the multi-party communication in how much communication he expressed. But when we looked at the communication partners of this participant, we saw that they used more different means of communication within the multi-party communication. They used more signs within the multi-party communication, and they also used more unique signs, so more different signs within the multi-party communication, when compared to dyadic communication. And that was especially when you took both communication partners together within the multi-party communication. So we can say that there is much more language being offered to the person with congenital deafblindness in a multi-party communication than in a dyadic communication. And when we look at the amount of communication in participant 2, then we saw that this participant used themselves more signs in the multi-party communication and also more unique signs in the multi-party communication when compared to the dyadic communication. And the communication partners of this participant also used more different means of communication in the multi-party communication, more signs. This participant could hear some, so they also used spoken language and they used more words within the multi-party communication. Also more unique signs and more unique words. So also here, within the multi-party communication, which had the same duration as the dyadic communication, there was much more language expressed. On this slide, we wanted to show you also something about the duration of the multi-party communication, because in the beginning I told you that people with that professional caregivers found it difficult to have multi-party communication with people with congenital deafblindness. So we thought they may be hesitant in doing multi-party communication. So we looked at the duration of the conversation in minutes. And as you can see on the two tables on this slide, both participant 1 and with participant 2, the duration of the multi-party communication increased during the sessions. So in the first session, the multi-party communication was almost 12 minutes for participant 1. And in the fifth, it was almost 14 minutes. So there was an increase. And for participant 2, the total duration was 10 minutes in the first multi-party communication and over 14 minutes in the last one. So we think there's a positive trend and people feel much more certain of themselves, sure of themselves, to have multi-party communication with a person with congenital deafblindness. Of course, we also asked the communication partners how they evaluated the intervention. And they said it was fun to be practicing with multi-party communication, and they found the intervention clear and feasible. And they also thought the education session was very clear to them, and they see the progress in their own skills in having multi-party communications themselves now. What they miss in the intervention is, especially at Bartiméus, people would like to have more knowledge about sign language. And they also would like to practice having tactile communication with the persons with congenital deafblindness. And their suggestion was to use the video feedback sessions also to practice tactile communication. So in conclusion, based on the two pilot cases, we can say that the intervention in general was instructive to them, and that we saw effects in the amount of communication and the amount of variation in communication and in the amount of initiatives of the person with congenital deafblindness. But we also found that the duration of the intervention was longer than expected. We thought the intervention would take about 4 months, but it took almost a year. And one of the factors in this was the COVID-19 restrictions, in which communication from such a short distance was difficult anyway, especially when you do it with 3 people together. And also implementation is a bit of a risk because professional caregivers come and go, and sometimes it's not easy to get exactly these 3 people together in a multi-party communication. So now the pilot study is over. We are going to inform the managers and the therapists more about the method, the intervention of multi-party communication in order to gain more people for the intervention study, which will be held with 10 persons with congenital deafblindness and their communication partners. And at the beginning of the study, we also had an international sounding board group session, and we will have a second one in September or October to discuss how the results of this intervention, and also how this intervention or a similar intervention can be applied in other situations. And herewith I reached the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and in case you have any questions or want to share your experiences or want to be involved in the study, or maybe you have a good advice for me, I would be very happy if you get in touch with me. And my email address is here on the slide. It's mworm@bartiméus.nl. And I would be very happy if you got in touch with me. Thank you and goodbye.